He called me his secret weapon the night before the dinner. He said it while adjusting his cufflinks in the mirror, not looking at me but at his own reflection, and I remember thinking how easy it was to love someone who made you feel essential. I folded the collar of his shirt down with both hands and told him everything was going to go perfectly. I believed it, too. That was the last night I believed most of what I told myself about our marriage. The dinner was at Meridian, a restaurant in the financial district that required reservations 3 months in advance and served food on plates that looked more like sculpture than something you were meant to eat. My husband had chosen it deliberately. He had a gift for understanding the language of rooms, what a venue said about a person before that person opened their mouth. Meridian said, "We have arrived." It said, "Take us seriously." He had coached me on it during the drive over, reminding me which fork went with which course, as though I hadn't grown up watching my grandmother host 8-person dinner parties every Sunday without a single note card. I wore a deep green dress I had bought myself. He had suggested something more understated, something that wouldn't pull focus, and for a moment I had considered it. Then I put on the green dress anyway. A small act of self-preservation I didn't fully understand yet. There were 6 of us at the table. My husband and his co-founder sat across from the 2 investors, a man and a woman who represented a venture capital group that could write a check large enough to take the company from promising to inevitable. I was seated beside my husband. His co-founder's girlfriend was beside me, a pleasant woman who spent most of the evening looking at her phone beneath the tablecloth. I didn't blame her. The conversation moved the way these conversations always do, slowly at first, carefully, everyone reading the room before committing to a position. The female investor asked questions that sounded polite but had edges. She wanted to know about the product roadmap, about the team's capacity to scale, about what differentiated their approach from the 4 other companies doing something adjacent in the same space. My husband answered well. He was always good at this, the performance of confidence, the way he could make a room feel like he had already won and they were simply catching up. But then she asked about the initial market research, the methodology, the specific insight that had shaped the product's core architecture. And my husband said, "We brought in a consultant early on who helped us think through the framework." I set down my fork. He continued talking. He described a process of research and iteration that I recognized because I had built it, 18 months of my life. I had left my position at the architecture firm, a partnership I had spent 9 years earning, because he had asked me to help him build something from nothing, and I had believed in the idea and more than the idea in him. I had conducted the research. I had mapped the user flows. I had built the first version of the pitch deck from a blank document while he was traveling for meetings I had also helped him prepare for. I had been his consultant, his researcher, his sounding board, his co-architect in everything except the legal documents where only his name and his co-founder's name appeared. A consultant. He said it easily, the way you mention something inconsequential, and moved on, and the investors nodded and moved on, and his co-founder refilled his wine glass and moved on, and the girlfriend under the table kept scrolling, and I sat very still in my green dress and understood something that had been assembling itself in the back of my mind for months and had just now arrived, fully formed, in the middle of a restaurant I had no reason to be in. I did not cry. I want to be clear about that. I didn't excuse myself to the restroom to collect myself. I finished the dinner. I asked the female investor a question about her fund's philosophy toward early-stage companies, and she looked at me with an expression I would later come to understand was recognition, and she answered thoughtfully, and we had an exchange that lasted perhaps 4 minutes and seemed to interest her. My husband glanced at me once during it, something uncertain moving behind his eyes, and then he redirected the conversation back to himself. In the car home, he told me the dinner had gone well. He said the investors seemed engaged. He said he thought they were going to move forward. I asked him who the consultant was. He was quiet for longer than the question required. Then he said he was simplifying for the room. He said they didn't need to know every detail of how the sausage got made. He said I knew how important this was and he needed the narrative to be clean and he was sure I understood. I told him I understood perfectly. He reached over and put his hand on mine and squeezed once and turned up the radio. That night I lay in the dark beside him and did not sleep. I had been not sleeping beside him in various configurations for 2.5 years, not sleeping while I stayed up refining pitch materials, not sleeping while I worried about his funding timeline, not sleeping while I tried to remember what I had wanted before his wants had expanded to fill all available space. The ceiling above our bed was the same ceiling I had looked at on 100 sleepless nights, and something about seeing it again from this particular angle made me think of a phrase my mother used to say. She said, "The problem with invisible work is that it makes you invisible too." I was very quiet getting dressed in the morning. I took only what was mine to begin with: my laptop, the external drive with my research files, my portfolio from my years at the firm, the small framed photograph of my grandmother that had sat on my side of the dresser since we moved in. I wrote nothing down. There was nothing to explain that the past 18 months hadn't already said more clearly than I could. I had a friend, a woman I had known since graduate school, someone who had gone the route of her own firm while I had gone the route of someone else's dream. And I drove to her apartment at 7 in the morning and knocked on her door, and when she opened it and looked at my face, she stepped aside without saying anything and put the kettle on. I want to explain something, because I think it matters. I have heard the way women talk about moments like this. The language of breaking points and sudden clarity. The dramatic pivot. Mine was not like that. I didn't leave because I finally found courage I had been missing. I left because I had been calculating quietly for months, and the calculation finally finished. I had been watching the pattern the way you watch a storm system on a weather map, tracking it, noting its direction, understanding that at some point it was going to make landfall. The dinner was landfall. I also want to explain something about the green dress. I did not wear it as a statement, but I have thought about it since, and I think some part of me already knew, even in the dressing room, that I was suiting up for something. My friend had a spare bedroom and a sharply practical mind, and absolutely no interest in watching me grieve a marriage she had privately been skeptical of for 18 months. She gave me 2 days of gentleness, and then she sat across from me at her kitchen table and asked me what I actually wanted to do next. I told her about an idea I had been circling for years. The kind of idea you keep returning to and setting aside because the timing is never right. Because someone else needs something. Because you're tired. It was connected to my work in architecture and to the research I had done for my husband's company, a kind of intersection I hadn't seen clearly until I had the space to look at it straight on. A platform that helped independent design firms manage investor relationships and project financing, built by someone who understood both the design world and the capital side of it from the inside. She listened without interrupting, which was how I knew she thought it had merit. Then she told me to write it down properly and she would make some calls. The next 6 months were the most focused of my life. I am not going to describe them as easy or as a montage of triumphant late nights set to inspiring music. There were weeks I was exhausted in a way that felt cellular, weeks when I questioned the math, weeks when a particular meeting went poorly and I drove home through the city reminding myself that I had been operating without a safety net for less time than I thought. But I had done this before. I had built something from nothing before. I had simply done it for someone else and for reasons that had nothing to do with me, and knowing that made a difference I hadn't anticipated. My mentor from the firm, a woman in her 60s who had built and sold 2 companies before returning to architecture because she loved the work itself, came in as an advisor. She had always made me feel, in that particular way certain older women can, that she had been waiting for me to stop apologizing for my own capabilities. She never said that directly. She didn't have to. Through her network, I was introduced to a small investment group focused specifically on design-adjacent technology. They were rigorous and they were patient, and after 3 meetings they offered to co-invest at a level that meant the platform could be built properly, not in the corners of someone else's life, but in the full light of its own. I signed the papers on a Tuesday afternoon and went home and made dinner and called my friend and told her, and she said obviously, in a tone that made me laugh for the first time in weeks. I kept a version of my husband's situation in my peripheral vision, the way you keep an eye on weather even when you're not traveling. Not obsessively. Not with the kind of attention that would have meant I was still oriented toward him. But practically, we had not finalized our divorce yet. His attorney had been slow, mine had not, and there were still logistics that required a minimal awareness of his circumstances. What I knew was that the funding from the investors at the Meridian dinner had not materialized the way he had expected. Something in the due diligence had apparently raised questions. He had pivoted the company's focus twice in 4 months, which is not necessarily a death signal in early stage but requires a narrative coherence he had historically relied on other people to build for him. His co-founder had stepped back from the operational side. By the time spring came around, what I heard through the various overlapping social networks that constitute a city was that the company was looking at a down round or a strategic partnership or possibly an acquisition, any port in a storm, the language of a venture that has started counting its runway in weeks rather than quarters. My firm was not a large fund. We were specific and selective, and we did not typically invest in anything outside our defined sector. But design-adjacent technology has broader edges than people assume, and when my mentor forwarded me a deck that had come through a connection of hers, she attached only a single line: "Thought you should see this before anyone else does." I recognized the company immediately. I recognized the market framing that had started 18 months ago, as a framework I had built on a whiteboard in our second bedroom. I read the deck carefully, twice, set it aside, slept on it. In the morning I read it a third time and asked myself the question I asked about everything: is there something real here beneath the narrative? And the answer, which I owed it to myself and to my partners to be honest about, was yes. The core technology was sound. The market was real. The problem the company was trying to solve was the same problem it had always been trying to solve, and it was a legitimate one. The execution had been inconsistent but not irrecoverable. I told my mentor I wanted to pass the deck to our full team for evaluation. She asked me if I was sure I could be objective. I told her I was the most objective person in the world to evaluate it because I knew exactly where the gaps were and exactly how to fill them, and if we decided to move forward it would be with full visibility into the company's actual history, not its curated narrative. She said, "That's what I thought you'd say." The formal meeting was held at our offices on a Thursday afternoon at 2 o'clock. There were 4 people on my side of the table and 3 on his: my husband and his co-founder and their attorney. I had told no one in advance who the founder was. My team had evaluated the deal on its merits and reached their own conclusion, which was that under the right terms and with specific operational conditions, it was a reasonable investment. I was reviewing notes at the head of the table when they came in. He saw me when he was halfway through the door. I watched the recognition move through him in stages: confusion first, then something that was not quite disbelief, then a kind of recalibration behind his eyes that I recognized because I had watched him do it in dozens of meetings over years. The moment he identified the room and decided how to play it. I did not smile. I was not unkind. I was simply the person running the meeting. I introduced my team. I outlined the parameters of our interest and the conditions attached to it. I asked the questions I had prepared, the same questions I would have asked any founder in any pitch meeting, though these I happened to already know the answers to, which was useful when the answers diverged from what I had asked. His co-founder spoke more than he did, which told me something about how the internal dynamic had shifted. At one point, toward the end of the formal portion, his attorney leaned over and said something close to his ear. He nodded once. Then he looked at me directly for the first time and said, "I think we need a few minutes." I said we had 15, and I would be happy to give them privacy to confer. My team and I stepped into the hallway and my mentor asked me, in a low voice, if I was all right. I told her I was better than all right. I meant it. When we went back in, they accepted the terms. I want to be careful here about what I am saying this story is. It is not a revenge story, though I understand why it looks like one from the outside. I did not structure the deal to humiliate him. I structured it to protect our investment, which is what my partners and my investors deserved. The conditions we attached were the conditions we would have attached to any founder whose execution history showed the particular pattern his did. They were appropriate and they were professional and they were, as my mentor said afterward, the most meticulously documented terms she had seen us produce, which I took as a compliment. What I am saying is that the green dress was not an accident. Or rather it was, in the moment. But I have come to believe that we telegraph our own turning points before we consciously arrive at them, that the self knows things the mind is still catching up to. I bought the dress for a dinner I expected to be triumphant. I wore it to a dinner that turned out to be an ending. And I walked into that conference room 6 months later in a different dress, a different building, a different version of myself, and the thing I wore most visibly was not anything I had put on that morning. It was the particular calm of a woman who had decided, at some point in the preceding 6 months, that she was no longer going to be the secret weapon in someone else's story. My grandmother used to say that a woman's real power is what she knows she could do but doesn't always do, and that the only person who needs to know the full extent of it is herself. I thought about her a lot in those months. I thought about the Sunday dinners, the white tablecloths, the way she moved through a room she had built and filled and presided over without ever needing anyone to name it for her. The divorce was finalized on a Friday in April. I had plans that evening with my friend and my mentor and 2 of the women from my team. We went somewhere loud and unnecessary and stayed too late, and I did not think about any of it: the dinner, the car ride, the ceiling above our bed, the consultant, until the following morning when I was making coffee in my own apartment, in my own kitchen, with my grandmother's photograph on the windowsill where I had put it the morning I left. I thought about it for perhaps 30 seconds. Then the coffee was ready and I poured it and opened my laptop and started working, which was, I had learned, the most honest thing I could do with any feeling. Turn it into something. There is a version of this story where I describe what I saw in his face when he walked into that conference room. I have started to write it several times and stopped because I find I am less interested in it than I expected to be. What I saw doesn't illuminate anything I didn't already know. What interests me more is what I felt in my own chest when my team stood up to shake hands at the end of the meeting and I stayed seated for a half-second longer than the rest of them, just long enough to feel the full weight of the room I had built, with the people I had chosen, around a table I was sitting at the head of. That feeling didn't have a name. I already knew. It was quieter than triumph and more durable. It felt like standing in a building you designed, running your hands along a wall you drew on paper before there was any wall, before there was any building, before anyone else could see what you were seeing. It felt like proof. The platform launched in September. The press coverage was modest and accurate and focused, for once, on exactly the right things. My name was in the second paragraph of every piece. Not because I had pushed for it. Because there was no other way to tell the story correctly without it. I still have the green dress. I have not worn it again. I keep it in the back of my closet the way you keep certain objects that don't need to be used to justify existing, as evidence of something, a marker between one time and another. Sometimes, when I'm getting dressed in the morning, I see the sleeve of it past the other clothes, and I think about that dinner. And I think about the version of myself who sat very still with her fork set down and decided, in complete silence, that she was going to remember everything. She did.